Thank you, everyone, for joining me. I am here with my guest, Phil Illy. I'm very happy that he is here, and we will be discussing the sexual underpinnings of transition, how transition is sexually motivated and even romantically motivated. And we will also be discussing specifically the rabbit hole of something called transabled identity, which is an outgrowth of transgender and other trans identities related to sexuality, where people identify as having a disability, either physical or mental or both. So I wanted to pick Phil's brain on this because he's written a very comprehensive book based on sexological research into the sexual side of transition and gender dysphoria. So, Phil, if you'd be so kind to just give a short synopsis of who you are, your background, and what your book covers in relationship to what we'll be discussing today.
So who I am, I'm just crossdresser. I wrote a book that explains autoheterosexuality, which is autogynophilia in males, which is the internalized attraction to being a woman, and autoandrophilia in females, which is their internalized attraction to being a man. And yeah, I wrote a book about this because it bothered me that there was a bunch of people that were feeling gender feelings that were confusing or even pursuing medical transition because of it, but they didn't have the words needed to make sense of their situation. There's plenty of people transitioning who don't know anything about autogynophilia or autoandrophilia, and they only find out afterwards. And often the clinicians don't know anything about it. So there's a lot of ignorance around the actual psychology of transgenderism, and I wanted to try to make it comprehensible to people so that they could be better gatekeepers of themselves, and also so that clinicians could also learn how to start doing their jobs a little better in terms of understanding what their clients are going through.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and your work has been interesting to me personally as someone who definitely had some sexual confusions going on related to my transition and the porn I was using and all sorts of fantasies. It's been very interesting. So, this is just a starting point here, but the thesis of this video is that people are transitioning because of sexual reasons and sexual attractions and just different sexual sensations and fantasies related to sexuality. So, would you say this is accurate? And if so, why?
It's definitely accurate to say a lot of people are transitioning for reasons that are ultimately an outgrowth of their sexuality, even though for a lot of them it doesn't, their feelings about their gender don't feel necessarily tied to their sexual orientation. Some of them just have this like longing to be the other sex, and they don't realize that it's connected to their admiration of the other sex. And it's fair to say that it's responsible for a lot of transitions because Ray Blanchard demonstrated that, at least for males, that all of the male to female transitioners who are non-homosexual with respect to birth sex, which is heterosexual, bisexual, or asexual, that they were motivated by a type of sexuality he called autogynophilia, which is love of self as a woman. And there hasn't been a similar body of research into the female to male transitions yet. So I can't say with the same sort of certitude and confidence that I can for natal males. However, I do think there's that internalized heterosexual attraction plays a role in the gender transitions of, I would say, most females who go on testosterone and do social transition, that the autoandrophilia is one of their motivators for doing so.
This is probably in some ways intuitive to people when just think of a trans person. If you don't know much about gender ideology or sexological history of this issue, it probably seems intuitive, right? That this is related to sexuality. But I think there's a lot of people that don't really understand the theory behind it. So, would you mind explaining kind of the theory and what it's called and maybe just make sense of it for maybe a person that has never heard of this before?
So there's this broader sexological theory called erotic target identity inversion theory, which is a mouthful, but the erotic target is just the type of thing that someone is attracted to. The identity inversion refers to that attraction being internalized into themselves and making them identify as another thing or feel dysphoria about not being another thing. And so, erotic target identity inversion theory describes autogynophilia and autoandrophilia in terms of internalized gender-based attraction. But there's also other dimensions of sexual attraction, such as attraction to disability, most iconically attraction to being an amputee, where people want to get their limbs amputated for identity, emotional reasons. At least that's what they report when they were asked in studies what the reasons were, but they gave a secondary reason of that they had a sexual interest in it too. But when they ask their primary reason, they don't mention sexuality, even though that seems to be what's causing it. And there's, in addition to transgender and transabled, there's also trans age, which is when people are attracted to being kids. Usually that's internalized, the orientation that shan't be named. And there's also trans species, where people are attracted to being another species. And there's also trans race, where people are attracted to being another race.
And that's what I wanted to talk about. This idea, it's definitely, whether we know the roots of it or not yet, there's definitely a phenomena happening, especially as people find other like-minded people online and form these subcultures. There's these Reddit forums about trans species and trans age and trans disability. So there's increasing numbers of people that are getting into this for whatever reason. So it's a phenomena, and it obviously on the surface seems pretty cringe, and it's something that doesn't seem like the most functional way to live in the world. Some of it seems sort of fantasy based, like a very childlike fantasy based, and I think there's a lot of kids that are into this kind of thing. They're making up characters about themselves, like middle school, high school aged kind of teenagers that seem to be into this. When it gets into inhibiting real life functioning, that's when we're calling it, in a psychological sense, that's when we're calling it a pathology, is when it's interfering with your functioning somehow or integrating into society in the way that you'd like. So it definitely poses problems. Besides it's not just an innocent kind of teenage fad. It definitely has consequences for relational health, being able to have relationships with other people, your own sense of self, and possibly your ability to work and function with the rest of society. I've seen a couple pride flags recently that describe these kind of absurdist, abled, disability-based identities. So I just wanted to read some of these to you and then just gather your perspective. So one of them is trans manip suicide, where someone wants to be emotionally manipulative in a suicidal sense, or someone using their suicidal actions and thoughts against another person for their own gain or just for fun. So this one was like a major mind fuck to me, because with cluster B pathology, with people that are narcissistic and sociopathic, there's a lot of manipulation, like intentional manipulation. And with the trans suicide myth, this idea that if you don't, it's either transition or death that's propagated. I feel like it almost seems like it's a parody of it, like that trans people have a reputation for being emotionally manipulative, and this identity seems to be validating that. I guess an exact transabled, I think it's in from that forum, but that one seems to be another thing of itself, like an emotional disability or a mental illness based
Seems pretty
versus
niche.
physical.
Not many people have
Pretty
that. Like
niche.
maybe one person made that page.
But what's interesting is that there does seem to be some kind of communal colluding with these different really niche identities. Like I saw this post: trans trauma beings are valid and loved. Trans trauma beings are not mocking cis trauma beings. Trans trauma beings are not inherently fetishizing cis traumatized beings. Trans trauma beings' trauma is equally as valid as cis traumatized beings. And that has a couple hundred likes on it. So I guess this identity is another kind of mental, emotional, psychological disabled identity, where you're identifying as someone that has the trauma of another person. I saw another one that they've made a flag for it called mere trans trauma, which is where you become aware of someone else's trauma. You desire to have the same trauma happen to you. So there does seem to be like several different types of identities that are, in my opinion, based, where someone is so dissociated from their body or reality that they are fantasizing about trauma happening to them. Another one here is trans sexually abused. So this is a person who identifies as sexually abused or wants to be sexually abused. So there's another one here, perma bleeding, when someone identifies as permanently bleeding. They want to be continuously bleeding. Trans ovarian cyst, a term where people feel that they should have one or more ovarian cysts. So there's obviously, these are very absurd. And I don't think these are, as you said, the most common is going to be the
They don't seem
amputee.
representative of transableism in general.
And so that's why I'm wondering. So your initial thoughts are, that's why I want to know, what are your initial thoughts on this? Because my intuition was that these are pretty disassociated people that probably have trauma, and this is their way of personally rationalizing it in some kind of creative way. But it also seems like there might be a sexual component to these types of ideas, especially imagining yourself being sexually abused. So I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
It's hard for me to say with too much confidence because those examples you gave, I haven't seen them mentioned in any papers, for example. Whereas experiences such as wanting to be amputated or wanting to become paralyzed or wanting to become blind or incontinent are things that I've seen show up in papers. Yeah, I'm not sure what to think of these more psychological ones.
Yeah, I think these are definitely, clearly they're originating on Reddit, right? They are newer. There's obviously no research base, but tell me about some of the research that you've read. It seems that there's a clustering of more physically transabled identities, and there's research that suggests that this is more common than the psychological, perhaps.
Yeah, typically the sort of things that are thought of as transableism are conventionally the label for it now is body integrity dysphoria, or the name for the particular sexuality that causes it, at least with the amputation one, is autogynophilia, which just refers to having one's limbs cut. And basically, the people who want to have an amputation, the vast majority of them, when they're asked in studies about whether they're attracted to amputees themselves, that they are attracted, specifically really attracted to amputees. And so that ties in with the idea that they have an internalized form of that sexual interest in amputees. And also most of them report that they've done what they call pretending before, which is where they may tie back a leg and then mimic having one of their legs amputated or go move around in a wheelchair or crutches to simulate being disabled. It's like the transabled equivalent of cross-dressing, but it's just for disability. And they over time they do this simulation of disability as a way of expressing their feelings of wanting to be disabled and a way of coping with it, and it helps at least temporarily reduce their felt sense of body integrity dysphoria. And then over time that can develop into a solidified strong wish to have their limbs amputated permanently. And some of them start that on their own. Like they'll sabotage their own legs, for example, like by covering them in dry ice to freeze it, or like injecting feces under the kneecap or something, like, or laying down next to train tracks and having a train run over them, things like that, to injure their legs beyond repair, either severing them or giving themselves gangrene or some other form of necrosis. And then at that point, then a hospital, according to medical ethics, would then have to help them because they're injured. Whereas a lot of times it's hard for them to get hospitals to just do that as an elective surgery unless it's a crisis, which is why a lot of them start the process on their own.
Yeah, and the research, correct me if I'm wrong, but the research indicates that there is an overlap with the amputee identity or desire and trans identity issues.
There's a population overlap where transgender identity or gender dysphoria are present at elevated rates in the transabled population. And this goes for both males and females. And this is what you would expect if the internalized sexual attraction described by erotic target identity inversion theory, if that psychological mechanism that turns sexual attraction inward happens with gender, then if it happens with one aspect of one's orientation, then it seems more likely that it could also happen with another aspect. If someone has attraction across multiple dimensions, whether race, disability, gender, etc. And yeah, there's a population overlap, and gender and transgender identity are present at elevated rates in the sort of transabled population.
So it's your belief that this erotic target issue is the preliminary cause of gender dysphoria?
For most cases of trans identity, there's also a homosexual type of trans, which is responsible for a minority of cases of that's basically when it has an early onset. It's sometimes called early onset gender dysphoria, euphemistically, rather than calling it homosexual gender dysphoria. But from a young age, the kids who have this, they have very overtly gender nonconforming behavior. And if someone were to look at them, they would probably think that kid's going to grow up to be gay. And during the onset of puberty, for most of them, that sort of their gender confusion, or however they think of it, or their dysphoria, it resolves for most of the homosexuals upon puberty, when most of them realize after getting their first crushes or boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever that, oh, I'm just gay. And then they reinterpret their experience under that lens. And then therefore they don't have to transition because they're just gay. But that's just a minority of transitioners. And I think it's, yeah, among males, it's less than 20% of them. And among females, I think it's less than 30% of them. By far, I think the most common type is the one that's caused by internal sexual attraction.
So what percentage then would you give of the trans identified population is transitioning for sexually motivated reasons?
So the way I do that calculation is by adding up all the non-homosexuals. And like I mentioned earlier, that describes people that have some attraction to the other sex, whether they're heterosexual or bisexual. And it also includes the ones who don't have attraction to the other sex, can be categorized as asexual, perhaps. And if you do that calculation of adding up the non-homosexuals in the large transgender surveys in the US, which they're community surveys, they're not clinical samples. But the calculation I arrived at was that about 8 out of 10 trans women, like at least 8 out of 10, are categorized as autogynophilic, according to this method of adding up the non-homosexuals. And then if you were to add up the non-homosexuals among trans men, the figure is about 7 out of 10. So it's a majority for sure. And the sort of an indirect indicator that this is the case is that the sort of the transgender ideology that's been created, it seems to be fine-tuned to be protecting one's sense of identity, to protect trans people's sense of identity. And it's the beliefs within that ideological structure are very much what you would expect to be the case if the people who created that gender religion are either autogynophilic or autoandrophilic. You
How
know,
so?
like the catchphrase "trans women are women, trans men are men." It's telling them that they are exactly the thing that they want to be. And if you challenge it to any degree to say that you can't become the other sex, or maybe it's not good for trans women to be in women's sports, there's intense opposition to that because it's implying that they're not the other sex completely and fully. It goes against the sort of pathology of really bad gender dysphoria, where when someone has it real bad, they have existentially, they have their heart set on being the other sex to the greatest extent possible. And so anything that points out that they're not literally that, it hurts them. And so the ideological structure has evolved to suit the more intractable subset.
So the existential longing, what is the overlap between that fantasy as escapism? How should I put this? It feels like people have an existential longing to be the opposite sex for, as you describe, romantic sexual reasons. As in, would it be fair to say that this existential longing by the more dogmatic types that kind of have magical thinking about it, that magical thinking is akin almost to like when you have an infatuation or kind of love addiction type sense of obsession with another person, but then that fantasy is just turned inwards. So it's this unobtainable fantasy, very similar to a romantic unobtainable fantasy, like the way it would work emotionally for that person.
Yeah, it's pretty much that. It's an internalized version of heartbreak.
I'm very familiar with such things. Yeah, and that's the thing that rings very true in my experience. But there's also other components where they're also, and this is a theory that I'm extrapolating a lot, is that transition is used as a panacea for executive functioning problems. And these are people that are autistic typology. So they're struggling emotionally, they're struggling socially, and they're struggling to grow up. They're struggling to find their place in an adult society. And the people that are transitioning today are mostly teens and emerging adults, so say 18 to 25. And this is, in my hypothesis, correlated with emerging existential dread of adult integration, especially with unconscious reproductive drives. So these people are autistic typology. They're not fitting in socially throughout their lives. That's an early onset problem, you could say. And then they are hitting against this existential anxiety because the gaps between what they want out of life and what they need is becoming larger and larger as they develop at a more delayed rate as compared to some of their peers because of their autistic typology. And they're overwhelmed by this existential dread. And so, for different reasons, they began to project that onto their sex and believe that transition is some kind of panacea, that they will be able to solve their social and emotional issues by becoming the opposite sex, that if they change their bodies, they will have a better quality of life as the opposite sex. But obviously, when they transition, their executive functioning problems are still there. And in fact, it actually increases dysphoria, and it increases this entropy between where they are in life and their goals. And so I feel like perhaps what a lot of people conflate with dysphoria is actually existential anxiety that's projected onto the body. I feel like that's what we're seeing today with a lot of these autistic type girls and boys. And I'm wondering that layer of contemporary trans identity in the youth culture, how that might be involved, or how autosexual drives might be involved in that or not involved. I'm curious what you think of that theory.
I think the autists are generally autosexual, and if you look at the words themselves, they both start with the same root of auto, first or self. So as you see with autistics, they often have internalized a lot of their thinking. They have a rich internal world. And my sort of working hypothesis for this overlap is just whatever psychological mechanism it is that makes a person's sexual orientation be routed outward versus inward. I think that autistics are more likely to have that mechanism inverted as part of their broader internalization that happens with their psychology.
Is there any research on this?
There's not any research on the actual nature of the mechanism yet, because scientists would have to understand the brain a lot better than they do right now. And we can only infer things about it based on more outwardly visible things, such as population overlaps and things like that.
So there's no mention of autism in the literature.
Oh, they weren't always using that word, but I know that I think in some of Blanchard's writing, he mentioned that a lot of the autogynophiles seemed like the type of men that had conventionally masculine jobs and often working with things rather than people, like working on computers. They really like to be online. And Lawrence also wrote about that, how the autogynophiles tended to spend a lot of time on computers and really like computers and seem to have Asperger's traits, as they called it at that time. So the sort of overlap between Asperger's or autism and being autogynophilic, that's been noted by clinicians for a while now.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that's only really being noted in males, not females.
Yeah, females weren't studied as deeply. I'm sure there's a lot of reasons why. Part of it is male sexuality. It's easier to study because penile arousal is just so obvious. Like they can literally measure it in a way that cannot be done with females yet. And there's some measures of female physical arousal, but they're not as straightforward and robust with their findings as with males. And also male sexuality tends to be higher. So back in the day before the internet was something everyone did, the population that scientists had access to were just people that ended up in their clinics or were referred to them by other clinicians. It was people that had these problems bad enough to where they decided to seek professional help. And whereas nowadays everyone can just freely find their own little special community online and gather together online, and we can see a broader swath of the people that have these forms of sexuality and dysphoria because they're all posting openly online, whereas in the past it was just something that only clinicians saw, which is why they thought it was a lot more male skewed. Whereas like nowadays, there have been plenty of studies done where females have been asked about paraphilias, and although they almost always endorse paraphilic sexual interests at lower rates than males do, that nonetheless some of them endorse these forms of sexuality, such as autogynophilia or autoandrophilia. And yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons why there's a sex difference in how often these were seen in the past. But with the democratization of the internet, I think these phenomena in females is becoming more visible.
And with the amputee the amputee identity population, I'm guessing those were primarily males.
Yeah, historically, yeah. I know the first study of them, it was like 8% of them were female, 92% were male. But in general, with these studies, more recently, the average seems to hover around 20. Like I said, there was that 8% study, that first one, but then there's also I've seen another study that had 36% female, but it generally hovers 15 to 25% female in these cohorts. And then when I've looked at say like in the subreddits related to body integrity dysphoria, so their informal polls there, it seems more like maybe a third of them are female. So it's not 50-50, and females are still outnumbered, but it's not such an extreme difference as to think that the same phenomena doesn't happen in females.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about these I guess you could call them neo-transabled identities, like the ones that I listed to you. And there's different subreddits of these types of absurdist kind of psychological identities. And just from what I've observed, like on Tumblr and the population, I'm guessing most of these are probably female. These people that are coming up with these really niche ones and they're designing pride flags about it, because it does seem like more female typical behavior to design a social marker and to share it and try to create a group and a social in group based on that. That's pretty standard female typical behavior. And then so I wonder about these psychological identities. I know some of these are in subreddits that are overlapping with systems. So that's the rebranding of dissociative identity disorder. Do you have any thoughts?
On systems?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've looked at the overlap and usage of those. There's this tool that checks the overlaps in users between different subreddits, and there's just a wildly disproportionate amount of the users of those plural subreddits, whether it's DID or OSDD or plural. A huge amount of them are also participants in the trans subreddits and the autism subreddit, and just yeah, anything related to autism. And I do think that autosexuality plays a role with the systems, because the first transvestite organization that was longstanding, it was called the Society for the Second Self. And that sort of alludes to the idea that they felt like they had a second female self inside of them. And so it doesn't seem like such a leap for me. If autogynophilia can create a second self inside of you, then who's to say if some people have internalized attraction along multiple different dimensions that they can't have multiple different selves created internally because of their internalized attraction?
Yeah, that seems to make sense to me, especially when you also observe the overlap between the neurodivergent pride identities, which is basically the neurodivergent is again a rebranding essentially of autism. Yeah, they
Yeah.
do include ADHD and OCD and of course all manner of other conditions, but it was mostly to try to get away from what they view as paternalizing in the autism culture, where it's mostly doctors that are working with parents to cure their autistic child. And then these are autistic adults that are more functioning and more integrated. I know that term is controversial. I don't care, but they're higher functioning. They have fewer needs as adults than a lot of these more severely autistic kids that the parents are typically seeking help from. And so the neurodiversity movement was created mostly by these autistic adults who wanted to self-advocate and wanted to create their own community. And now it seems to have very strong overlap with the trans movement and these other kind of associative conditions, which it makes sense, right? Like why it had a social contagion that way, not just because there's an autistic overlap with people who have gender dysphoria, but also people that are already having an identity which may or may not be reflected in reality, right? Because identity is a self-report in some sense. But if they are autistic or they are divergent to the point where their behavior is interfering with their functioning in some way, like there's some level of pathology that's going on, that's a struggle for them, and it can be a disabling condition. It makes sense why that community of those self-identified people would be open to this concept of tolerance and inclusion with the quote unquote diversity of identities. So, with gender fluidity, so to speak, or the fluidity of having this internalized other sense of self or multiple senses of self. So, to me, it does make sense. But I guess the question is, obviously there's a spectrum of fantasy and how extreme it gets and how much it can interfere with one's functioning. Even just in my personal experience, like unrequited loves are extremely painful to deal with, and they are very disabling because the level of fantasy that I will get involved with for that is pervasive, deep, and intense. There's a crush, and then there's a very deep obsession. So the same kind of thing would apply here. I guess that's why I'm wondering, why don't you first start with your typical advice that you would give to a autosexual dysphoric person, like a young person, say 15 to 25 maybe? What would your typical advice be to that person?
I think it's important to start with understanding what it is. Although I might be biased because that's what I'm trying to get people to do is to understand why they feel the way they do so they can understand what's going on. But I would say that in general, they should try not just to consider that medicalization isn't the only option and that they should try a variety of ways of coping before pursuing that. And by understanding how the condition works, they can think of more creative ways of coping and also choose which aspects of it to reinforce. For example, if someone is, say you have a female who's autoandrophilic and she wants to have a man's body and dress like a man, behave like a man, be seen by others as a man, all of that. I would say it might be good for them to consider which aspects of it they reinforce, particularly if to reinforce the more obtainable aspects so they're not bummed out about not having something. If they could say if in terms of their sexual fantasies, if they could be aroused by behaving in a manly way and dressing in various manly clothes like jockstrap or whatever, that sort of focusing on those sort of things that are obtainable rather than unobtainable things might help reduce dysphoria over time. Of course, there's no research on which coping methods work for different outcomes, but it intuitively makes sense to me that there's like an operant conditioning process happening when you have an internalized sexual attraction, where if you do behaviors that symbolically invoke the idea of being the other sex, you'll feel better. And that will reinforce those behaviors that led to it and dissuade behaviors that make you feel disconnected from that part of yourself. And so over time, it'll cause you to behave, dress, think of yourself, etc., more as being like the other sex. And so I just think it's really good to be mindful about which aspects of it you're reinforcing so that just keeping that in mind as part of your broader long-term strategy.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it because there obviously is a philosophical debate to be had of how much is this permissiveness and enabling someone's unobtainable fantasy. Okay, let's use the metaphor again that pretty much everyone can relate to, which is unrequited love. There's
That's how it feels.
Yeah, I think it's a really similar sort of unobtainable longing, and I'm just thinking with whatever attachment figure that I've had at a given time, there's certain behaviors that I would say are more enabling the fixation. If I'm checking the person's social media on a daily basis, if I'm allowing myself to daydream about the person or self stimulating sexually about the person, yes, I could do that, but it also would be reinforcing the fantasy. The neural pathways are getting stronger, the attachment is continuing. But on the offside, it's also a self soothing mechanism because I can't be with that person or I miss that person. And so that might be a short term coping mechanism. But if I had to be honest with myself, those types of behaviors aren't ideal. ideally, I wouldn't be thinking about the person, masturbating to them, fantasizing about them being there, talking to them, whatever I might be doing, which is typically all those things. Like, ideally, I wouldn't be doing any of those things. But I do sometimes allow myself, or have allowed myself, to use that as a self-soothing mechanism, or some might say as a drug, to soothe myself temporarily. And so it's I would say it's actually a vice. I identify as having love addiction problems, but I don't think that's just a self ID. I think that's like notable. But again, it's like this, do we really want to be enabling, ideally, do we want to be enabling the conditioning of these attachments to these unobtainable things, is my point. Because probably not. But I fully empathize with how difficult it is to fully detach, or to, let's say, replace the fixation. Like, how do I get over an attachment figure, which is my unrequited obsession akin to the gender fantasy? I have to replace it with another attachment figure. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? That's my concern, is that it's very hard to find a balance, as you said, of what you're reinforcing, because really reinforcing any of it reinforces the entire unobtainable fantasy.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's good for people to understand how this works if they have these internalized sexualities, so they can not get themselves stuck in a trap in which they feel tremendous heartbreak, if possible. For some people, it doesn't matter what sort of actions they take, just how the orientation developed. Intractable suffering it will be inevitable for some of them, but I think there's a lot more wiggle room than people give it credit for. And for example, I know in Anne Lawrence's book, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, which is about autogynophilic transsexualism, she mentions this case study of like a transsexual woman who was doing what's called autoabasiophilia, which is just basically pretending to be disabled, or like having mobility impairments, using crutches and wheelchairs. And that person they felt like, what the hell am I doing? This is so ridiculous. And so they substituted, instead of that sort of transabled impulse, they substituted in the transgender impulse for it, because that was less upsetting to their sense of self. It's less weird. And if someone has multiple atypical sexual interests, there will be a degree to which they can switch out, reinforcing one for another. And I think, if possible, it's good for them to pick the ones that will lead to their long-term well-being.
Now, in terms of, again, continuing the love addiction metaphor, switching out ideally, the healing of love addiction is you gradually get your attachment figure to be healthier and healthier until the point where you are actually in a healthy reciprocal relationship. In the trans fantasy, is that possible? Is it possible to replace the attachment, or not, obviously not entirely replace all the feelings or beliefs or whatever, but primarily replace the self-attachment to the internal figure to an external figure? Is that possible? And although difficult, should we maybe be...
I think it depends on the ratio to which their sexuality is allosexual, which is externally directed, versus internally directed, which is autosexual. There is, like I said, there's some wiggle room. If someone is just predisposed to have similar degrees of internal and external attraction, if from the start they were conscious of that and consciously chose to not act on their internal attraction and just seek external partners, it would probably increase the odds that they could avoid becoming attached to that internal cross-gender self. But if they start getting attached to that inner self, it can be like a one-way street, in a sense, where it can be hard for them to detach from that later, even if they would want to, because it's just like the heart wants what it wants, and if you got attached to that and got accustomed to that, it's really hard to back out of it. So I think mostly that the people that have these sexualities, they should know why it's happening, and that I think that'll give them the greatest chance of being able to steer where they end up. Whereas if they continue to not understand that internalized sexual attraction and how it makes them attached to being another type of thing, that they're flying blind and they're just gonna be pulled in by the magnetic forces and just like unwittingly get attached to that.
Right. Yeah. It is like an addiction in many ways, just the further attachment, obsession of this unrequited, unobtainable situation. And it's very difficult because it involves yourself and you're with yourself all the time.
Yeah, that's the hard
Like,
part.
I can imagine how difficult that is, especially with like my love addiction stuff. Like, yes, the other person is involved. They're very important in this equation, but ultimately it is a fantasy in your own mind at some level. Like, there's definitely like a real relationship that you're having with another person, but also there's the relationship to the attachment figure that is just a self-soothing object just internally. And once that person is gone, your attachment to that internal attachment figure inside remains. And it's very hard to break that because it's internal. And so that's something that I still am working on myself. So I can imagine how hard it is when someone is unaware of it, of having this attachment in a opposite sex self way, where they don't know what's going on and they have this obsession. And then of course there's the spiritual aspect of it. And I think it's easier in many ways for people. I mean, obviously spirituality exists in some sense to have a synthesis and even a placebo of unexplained or complex phenomena. So I can understand why people that aren't aware of these sexual and attachment issues, that they believe these slogans, the dogmatic religious slogans, that's easier for them to just say, oh, this is my true self, this is my gender soul.
Yeah, it feels good.
There is a placebo effect, absolutely. But then you continue to chase it because you constantly hit the wall of reality. I'm on board with your message of just understanding what it is. It overlaps very strongly with my overall message of trauma healing, which is radical acceptance, just radically accepting what's going on without judgment and having neutrality towards it. And then we can start to bring in, like, how are we actually going to change our behavior or our thoughts? So, not that it needs to be stated, but obviously these issues are controversial for many reasons. But that's why I'm so on board with talking to you and discussing them, because ultimately people are suffering and they don't understand why. And just having awareness of the phenomena is the first step. So, in terms of the transabled, there really do seem to be a lot of similarities between that and what's going on with the sexual motivation for this sexual attachment fantasy. And I can see how it becomes the sexual attachment fantasy to this even more abnormal sense of self, which is even more destructive. And that is a concern for me as the internet continues to get, as people grow accustomed to living digitally, and with the introduction of different forms of cyber or digital realities and AI and these different sort of virtual realities, that the disassociation from the body is just going to get more pervasive. And so I think the transabled, yes, as it stands, we don't have mainstream organizations like the ACLU or whatnot. For the most part, they're not hanging a amputee flag out there with the trans flag, but I feel like that's not something that's actually out of reach, given obviously what we've seen here with this like permissiveness culture around this. So I suppose I would ask, what advice might you have for someone that's dealing with a transabled or even a kind of plural or like this level of disassociation where you have these multiple internal senses of self? Do you have advice on how to deal with that kind of compounded issue?
Yeah, I would say similar to what you said, where you talk about the importance of radical acceptance. I think it's important to accept reality. And when I want people to understand it, it is so that they can, to accept reality, first you have to understand reality. And so I want the people with these internalized attractions to understand what it is and where it's coming from. And then in terms of the longing it creates, I think they should be realistic about what is within their control and what is not. Like, for example, with regards to transgenderism, it's within someone's control to take hormones or often to get surgeries, but it's not within their control to have other people address them with particular pronouns to see them a particular way. If people can change the things that they can change, but accept that there's some things they don't have control over, I think that will help with maintaining calmness and composure while they're dealing with it. And like you mentioned with online, how we live such a disembodied life these days, and these sort of cross identities, they make you want to be something that doesn't match your body. And so it's really tempting to just be online all the time and get attached to this sort of construct that doesn't match your body, and that can make you get more and more alienated from yourself over time and develop dissociation symptoms. And I think it would be good for people to make sure they're exercising, because that gets them in touch with their body in a very real, tangible way. If they work out, it will help reduce some of that disconnect with their body.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very good advice. Yeah, this conversation's been interesting. It's challenging because we have a lot of questions and we don't have a lot of answers. And obviously, research is limited. And especially as soon as we research something, then another crazy thing comes up, another subculture, another mutation of the phenomena. Yeah, I do just think it's important for people to understand, because it's very easy to mock it. It's very easy to intuitively just ignore it or chastise it or be angry at it, whether it be transgender or fetishism or any of these flags that I read off. But the truth is that underneath these things are human beings that are suffering. And as a culture, if we want a healthy society and we want, less violence, and we want healthier attachment, and we want more community, we need to address people that are suffering, even if their suffering is difficult to understand. And that doesn't necessarily mean just enabling whatever they want because it's easier for us to just shrug it off. Sometimes it means thinking about these things and truly trying to empathize. That's why I wanted to use the unrequited love metaphor, because I think that makes it a lot easier for the everyday person to understand how this might feel and how it might affect you negatively. Yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts or plugs or anything that you would like to shout out or mention.
I think, like you said, it's important to remember that the people that have these feelings, that they are individual people with their own experiences. And I think I like to keep in mind that even though that, like, they're going to tell themselves their own story about why they are that way, and of course my explanation typically doesn't match up with it, because I came to my explanation by reading a bunch of papers and they came to their explanation by probably something a little less rigorous. I still keep in mind that they're trying to understand their experience and make sense of it, and even if their explanations are silly, it's important to just remember that they are humans with feelings. And as for if there's anyone that's listening to this that has experience with this sort of internalized sexuality or just wants to understand more about it, I wrote a book called Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex, that explains autogynophilia and autoandrophilia, and in a sort of like neutral scientific way. There's not really value judgments in there. I'm just trying to explain it. And that stuff's also available on my website, autoheterosexual.com. And I have a podcast where I interview people with these forms of sexuality called Autoheterophiles. And yeah, if anyone's interested, I recommend they check it out.
Yeah, awesome. Definitely check that out. And anyone listening, obviously reach out to either of us for support or more questions or whatnot. I'm sure we can direct to various resources based on what's going on. So, Phil, thank you so much. This has been a lot of food for thought, which is what I'm hoping for. And I'm sure we'll have further conversations about this as we both let our own understandings and observations percolate. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Laura.